All right, I see we have a majority of our RSVPs now joining us. Again, we're welcoming each other in the chat function, letting everyone know where we are from. And I'm Caitlin Kosick with the Urban Peace Institute, and you heard my colleague Jackie speak as well. We're behind the scenes if you need any help throughout the presentation, but I think we have a majority of our attendees and we can get started, and I can hand off to our hosts today, Barry and Paula Litt.
Okay, so can people hear me? I will assume they can. So I want to welcome everybody. It is no secret to people that there's been a lot of turmoil in the country around the role of the police. And so, and the wave of protests after the killings of last year. And so Paula and I wanted to have a discussion where we could get beyond slogans and talk about, like, what are solutions, what are ways of dealing with community safety and public safety that are working and that would have broad support. And so really the purpose of today is to have a discussion about that. And we asked Fernando, Rejón, and Connie Rice from the Urban Peace Institute. And I'm just going to do a very brief description of both of them, and then Fernando will speak, and then Connie will speak, and then there will be time for questions. People should try to put their questions in a chat if they can, and we'll try to sort through as many of them as they can. People can also just ask to be called upon to make comments or any other points they want to make. Will be a freewheeling discussion. So with that, let me just start. The Urban Peace Institute, basically an organization that was founded by Connie Rice. And its purpose really is to redefine how public safety looks and how it works. And it's become a leading force in the country around issues of public safety and community and just policing and reforms, particularly around issues of violence. So with that very brief background, there's a website and you can get more information on them from the website. Fernando Rejón is the executive director of the Urban Peace Institute. He's been working with it for many years. It started through the Advancement Project and it's now an independent 501c3 organization. And Fernando spearheaded the development of the Urban Peace Academy, which has trained over 4,000 community residents, law enforcement, and others around issues related to peace in communities, particularly communities that have been sort of had problems of violence within the community. In 2019, he founded the National Street Outreach Partnership, and in 2020 convened the Los Angeles Intervention Coalition, uniting 16 grassroots organizations to expand the work of peacemakers within the community. And he, my voice is going a little, is a member of the Biden-Harris Gun Violence Prevention 100-Day Subcommittee. So Fernando's got a great background in these issues, and you'll hear a lot more about what that entails. I'm going to introduce Connie now, so I don't have to then we can just have a smooth transition right from Fernando to Connie. Connie spent many years as a civil rights litigator, doing some very landmark work, and a lot of it around policing. And at a certain point, she reached the conclusion that there must be other ways to have more of an impact than litigation seemed to be able to have. And so she began to pursue building relationships, particularly with the LAPD. Now, I think it's gone beyond that, but she's worked with the LAPD for many years. She co-authored a report called A Call to Action, which addressed issues around gangs and violence in LA and was a key development in some of the work that Urban Peace Institute does. And she, with Charlie Beck, with whom she worked very closely, created the Community Safety Partnership, which she'll talk about today. If I left anything out from either Fernando or Connie, they should feel free to fill in. But with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Fernando. So Fernando, why don't we get started with you?
Thank you, Barry. It's an honor to be here. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this Saturday morning. So thank you to our hosts, Paula and Barry Litt, for pulling this together and supporting us. And thank you to everyone that joined. It's nice to see some colleagues and friends that are on this Zoom meeting this morning. So I'm going to talk about the Urban Peace Institute, talk a little about the history, the work that we currently do, and how we're moving forward. And this is all within the framework of reimagining public safety. So my name is Fernando Rejón. My background is in community organizing. I'm the executive director of Urban Peace Institute, and I've been organizing and working in the nonprofit field for about 20 years. I've been with Urban Peace for 13 years. So I've been writing with Connie for 13 years, so definitely learned a lot, but also working in the field of violence reduction, violence prevention through those years with ground level gang intervention practitioners, with law enforcement, with municipalities across the country, really looking at how do we address the violence, the community violence epidemic. And so Urban Peace, our mission is to implement violence reduction strategies and smart justice solutions to end violence and mass incarceration so communities can thrive. So as Barry shared, we started at the Advancement Project, which is a national civil rights organization. We were a program of the Advancement Project. Advancement Project started in 1999, as many of you know and have been supporting. Urban Peace really got kicked off really in like 2006. And in 2007, we released that report, A Call to Action. And the call to action was a 25-year audit on the war on gangs and the youth gang homicide epidemic in this region of LA. And part of what the report found is that there was millions of dollars that were being wasted to address community violence, and there was no coordinated, centralized strategy in order to really address the most impacted areas of the city. And so from that report, which weighs about 12 pounds because I've had to carry it around to different council offices, there's over 100 recommendations. And part of that was to develop a citywide comprehensive strategy, which really led to the creation of the Mayor's Office of Gang Reduction and Youth Development. And the difference here was that instead of divide by 15 council districts, instead of dividing $24 million was the initial investment, instead of dividing it by 15 council districts, it was millions of dollars were invested directly into the most impacted areas of the city, right? So that really changed the landscape of how the city addressed gang violence. And that was back in 2007. So of those 100 recommendations, one of the big recommendations was to really change the narrative about how we address violence, community level violence. And we utilize a public health frame, the public health approach, right? Which is to really shift the paradigm on how law enforcement and how city leaders, foundations, and community residents really look at violence. It's not just a law enforcement issue. Public safety goes beyond that. And that was years ago, right, in 2007. Two things that really stood out from the report that we like to highlight was that at the time you had Sheriff Baca and you had Chief Bratton, leaders of some of the largest police forces in the country say we cannot arrest our way out of this problem. And you'll hear that more and more from police leaders currently. The second thing was that we're not anti-gang, we're anti-violence. If you attack gangs, you make them stronger. And so how do you come up with a comprehensive public health strategy to address neighborhood level violence? How do you treat the problem, and not only using punitive measures, but also treat the problem in a way that an epidemiologist would treat an outbreak? And I think at this point of the pandemic, we're all pseudo experts in public health, and all the reading and everything that we've been through is we know a lot about the public health epidemic. Now apply those same practices to public safety and to violence. It really changes the paradigm of how we view things. So part of this was really how to get LAPD to create space for gang intervention and to build a strong intervention infrastructure as the tip of the spear. So gang intervention workers responding to violence at the street level, and then LAPD responding from different lanes. And luckily Connie was the expert on LAPD and sheriff, so she was able to leverage that space, right? Making sure that law enforcement gave enough space for us to help create, in partnership with the city, a gang intervention infrastructure that is probably the most robust in the country. And we know that because we've been to many different cities and helped to assess and build gang intervention infrastructures or street outreach, more known nationally, across the country. So we started by building out the Urban Peace Academy, and the Urban Peace Academy certifies all city contracted workers, and that's in partnership with the city. The city, it's called the Los Angeles Violence Intervention Training Academy. And it's a 140-hour curriculum training intervention workers on professionalism, on shuttle diplomacy, on concrete tasks, how to document their work and evaluate it. And that was really key to starting to build a professionalized, accepted gang intervention infrastructure that could really help address public safety. So it wasn't all going to be on LAPD's shoulders. You had former gang members who could come in, who've transformed their lives, who can come in and actually engage the hardest hit communities where violence was flourishing. So that work was really pivotal because that really led us to provide a lot of technical assistance and training across the country, to where you have cities across the country that reached out and said, how do you build gang intervention infrastructure? Can you come and train peacemakers? And Urban Peace's work really evolved from there. So as you know, in 2015, we spun off and we created the Urban Peace Institute to live more into our mission, to focus on our mission, to be able to broaden out the work that we do. The Urban Peace Academy was part of that pivot point to really building out a broader understanding of community-based safety experts who can contribute to overall safety in our communities. And so, for example, we provide technical assistance and training to LAPD for the CSP program, which Connie will talk about, council offices, to county agencies like the Office of Violence Prevention, and then even nationally, right? Oakland, New York, Chicago, and other cities throughout. And for example, in Chicago, we have our first sister academy. It's the Metropolitan Peace Academy. They have 140-hour training. They utilize our standards of conduct and practice for intervention workers, and they're really building out a very innovative infrastructure for that city. Right now, public dollars there, it's about 11 million. In LA, it was up to 28 million public dollars invested in this strategy. With some of the cuts, I think it's down to 25.5 million. So just to get a sense of how much is being invested. And LA has one of the most robust investments citywide than any other city in the country. A lot of our work as well moved into smart justice. And so Josh Green leads that work. He's a senior staff attorney and he's our director of criminal justice reform. The smart justice work was pivotal because as we started moving forward, we had to begin talking about the nexus between violence prevention as well as criminal justice reform. So as we look to shrink the criminal justice system, how do we redirect those funds to really build infrastructures that are not going to rely on the enforcement of laws for safety? That our narrative around safety is a lot broader than just enforcement of laws, and broadening that concept has been critical, especially during this time. We also develop community-based leadership institutes to develop resident leaders and safety campaigns, community-based safety campaigns where residents can advocate for what they need in their areas. And this is, done in Spanish and English, and everything that we do is engaging the Latino community, but also the African-American community and building bridges to have more of a united front, to be able to coalesce the needs of both communities to push for safety, to be addressed differently, but then also to hold LAPD accountable, to really build capacity for communities to engage law enforcement in conversations that are desperately needed. So this is what we've been working on. We were working on prior to the mass protest last spring, and really, for us, our response was, this wasn't a shock. We knew about police violence, we knew about the issues in the community, and now there's a larger platform. And so, while back in 2007 we were pushing for a public health response to it, now it's shaping into reimagining public safety, right? Which I believe is an even broader understanding of how we're imagining safety. The public health approach is still a part of that, but now I think the conversations that are happening not only here in LA but nationally are really pushing people to think beyond just a public safety strategy, just strategies to address violence, and really looking at holistic strategies for the most impacted communities of color. So part of reimagining public safety is, I really translate when people are saying we need to reimagine public safety and specifically talking about defunding police, I translate that into really, when people are saying defunding the police, we're talking about ending the history of structural racism and state violence. And in the sense, in order to understand that, because there's a spectrum of people saying, hey, we need to reform police, all the way to we need to defund police. The conversations within that space are really pushing for a new reimagination of how to address safety that goes beyond law enforcement. And so the framework that UPI uses is we utilize a divest invest strategy or framework. And the key is really to radically transform American policing, but also divest from systems that continue to oppress communities and invest to build up infrastructures that are going to allow communities to thrive. But I think in order to understand that, we have to look at the context of policing, the history of policing. So as the United States was becoming industrialized, you had police being used to suppress protests for workers' rights. You had colonialism through the killing of Mexican and indigenous people, but also you had slave patrols using containment strategies to keep African slaves on the plantation. And so in the name of manifest destiny, you had patrols like the Texas Rangers utilizing state violence in order to gain territory. And so when we look at that history and how policing has evolved, we look at the evolution of the criminal justice system. I think Michelle Alexander really, set the tone with her book, The New Jim Crow, really looking at the evolution of the criminal justice system from slavery. And as you know now, if you're, watching the national conversation, we are still dealing with the legacy of racism, with the rise of white nationalist movements, which is this ideology that we are trying to address. And that history, understanding how power has evolved and how the criminal justice system has devastated many communities of color, looking at the impacts of mass incarceration, looking at the impacts of police violence, looking at systemic disinvestment from the most impacted areas of our communities. This is really the time to have this conversation about what does it mean to shift national values around how we invest in communities. And so Urban Peace Institute, we talk about we need seismic investment to really shift a lot of the resources that were put into the criminal justice system and create an economy that allows communities to thrive. And we'll talk a little bit about that more with gang intervention. But also it's important to understand that the enforcement of laws alone does not generate safety. And we have to understand what makes communities feel safe. Because even if there's a low number of homicides, there's a low number of aggravated assaults or Part 1 crimes, people still need to have a perception of safety, that they can walk outside, their children could go to school, they could go to the parks. How do we get there? So part of the work, one of the areas that we focused on, as I mentioned with the Urban Peace Academy, is in order to broaden the public safety conversation, is we had to build a strong gang intervention infrastructure. So for those of you who aren't familiar with gang intervention workers have been critical to LA's public safety strategy for a decade and has contributed to one of the safest decades that the city has seen. So for the last 10 years, LA has been below 300 homicides, which is very significant. Part of that work has been to ensure that any type of homicide or shooting at the street level was responded to by gang intervention workers and law enforcement. So having intervention workers step up, professionalize their work, and start to engage at the community level, engage people that are involved in gangs, to engage shooters out in the community to interrupt the transmission of violence has been critical to achieving a level of success. But for us, 300 is still too many. In 2019, the city ended with 256 homicides. This year, we ended with like 349, right? So we're almost 100 higher than we were last year. But also, we wanted to push for a vision zero. And one of the key things that I remember is one of Chief Beck's last speeches at the LA, at the gang conference. I think it was in 2018. He said, he talked about, he was reflecting, and this is a room full of peacemakers from all over the country and even internationally. He was focusing on, he was really reflecting on what he has helped achieve, with Connie, with gang intervention, with the grid office. And he said, you know what, I can see zero. I could see us getting to zero. And for me, that was very important because when he said I can get to zero, you have somebody whose DNA is LAPD, who is a national leader of one of the largest law enforcement agencies in the country, really say, I see us being able to get to zero. That was very significant and really shifting how people envision what is possible when you broaden out the infrastructures to address safety. So gang intervention has stepped it up, right, over the past 10 years, reducing the likelihood of retaliation by 42%. And so we have evaluations that'll demonstrate and say that we have, when law enforcement alone responds to a crisis or a homicide scene, the likelihood of retaliation is high. When law enforcement and gang intervention in its own separate lane respond to a critical incident, the likelihood of retaliation drops 42%. And that is because of the infrastructure and support and relationships that gang intervention workers have. So gang intervention workers, they have what we call the license to operate. They have credibility, being former gang members, formerly incarcerated, after transforming their lives, after going through training, understanding a level of professionalism, and getting paid a salary to engage active gang members or potential shooters to reduce the likelihood of violence, to provide alternatives. And one of their strongest assets is really, one is their reputation, but two is their ability to what we call proactively engage folks. So proactive peacemaking, preventing people and providing alternatives. So as you see the surges in South LA and Boyle Heights right now, is you have gang intervention workers out there that are trying to provide alternatives to violence for people that are potentially going out there and shooting. And their work to really know and navigate communities is really essential during this time. So it's dangerous work. You have to have a deep passion. You have to have expert skill. You have to know shuttle diplomacy. You have to know mediation. You have to be able to set up non-aggression agreements. You have to be able to really have a strong analysis of what is happening in the various neighborhoods. And how do you proactively build relationships with individuals that can actually create levels of violence in the community. But another piece, aside from the violence interruption piece, you have case management. And the case management piece focuses on behavioral change. So how do you get some of these young men and women who are ready to leave the life, move into support services to really address what some of their needs are, whether that be trauma or anything that happened in their lives, and begin to help really stabilize the community and put them on a pathway toward job training and other resources that are going to help them work through their issues. So we provide that training and support to broaden and expand the infrastructure that is actually really going to go beyond just gang intervention. We've been working with the Department of Public Health to create and train community health workers. So intervention workers were perfect folks who could do the community health work. They have the relationships. They just had to be trained on health information, passing out PPE, how to stay safe during the pandemic. It's important to note that the city and county classified gang intervention workers not only as essential during the pandemic, but also as emergency personnel. And the interesting thing was at the beginning of the pandemic, they didn't have access to PPE. There was no PPE to be found. We were having trouble to find some. So we were calling our networks, and we ended up calling our partners, talking to our partners in Chicago. And in Chicago, they said, hey, we found a place we can get PPE, because they have 100 street outreach workers out there. And we said, great, can you send us some? So we ended up getting in contact with the nail salon out there, and they sent us 500 pieces of PPE. So as intervention workers were out there in the streets, we broke up that 500 to the intervention agencies in order for them to feel safe, in order to protect themselves and their families when there was really no resources there. And so part of that, part of how they pivoted their work from not only violence interruption, but they also became virus interrupters. Their credibility in the streets really allows them access to have conversations about public health, about how to wear masks, why it's important to wash your hands, where to go for resources, where to get tested, if somebody did catch COVID, what to do, what not to do, how to isolate yourself, even support with isolation, whether it's getting in a hotel room to stay away from the family so you don't infect everybody. So their work has really been pivotal. They've also passed out food where families would come up to them in the line and say, thank you for passing out this food, because if you weren't here, I don't know how my kids would eat this week. So that is the important pivotal work that they're doing. And for them, I think they're at a point now where intervention work has really, there's been a lot put on gang intervention over the years. And during this pandemic, it pushed them into that stretch zone where they have to go above and beyond their traditional duties to address the needs of the community. And so part of for this reason, and then also with in response to the mass protests, we pulled together the LA Intervention Coalition, which are 16 frontline gang intervention agencies who advocate for resources to be redistributed to their communities. And so right now we have a Fund Peacemakers campaign. The Fund Peacemakers campaign is asking for $54 million to be invested in gang intervention. And the $54 million is being asked to come from the $150 million that was taken from LAPD. Currently, of the $150 million that was taken from LAPD, there's about $88 million remaining. We're asking for $54 million of that to be invested to really build out a more robust infrastructure and to really reimagine public safety and target those dollars into the most impacted communities of color in the city. And so that campaign has been moving forward. But also, they haven't had a raise in over 10 years. And so the salary range for gang intervention workers in the city of LA is $32,000 to $38,000. And one reporter told me, you can't even live off that in Iowa. And I said, yeah. And part of the work that they've done over the decade to reduce violence and really stepping up, it really to me speaks volumes. And so we're pushing for a $45,000 minimum wage or minimum salary for gang intervention workers. In Chicago, the range is $35,000 to $45,000. In Oakland, the range for peacemakers is $45,000 to $50,000. And so we need to we're really doing some work to raise the profile of gang intervention and let people know how vital their services are and what we need to do. And so that also includes in the county, right? With Measure J funding, it includes the Alternatives to Incarceration platform, all the probation reform work going on. That's really critical, because when we go to the county, we're going to talk about hundreds of millions of dollars that we're going to ask. And also too, because the county has custody, and in custody, we need to get intervention workers, violence prevention folks, reentry folks behind the walls to help people reintegrate back into the community once released. So that's part of our work around gang intervention, and the Funding Peacemakers campaign is really to establish a coalition of voices that can speak directly. These are people on the front lines, dealing with shootings, dealing with homicides, that can speak directly to decision makers. We've met with council members, we've met with supervisors' offices, we've met with candidate Gascon before he was elected. We're really creating a platform for us to help reshape how decisions are made regarding funding and where that funding should be funneled. I just want to touch on our Smart Justice program as well. So UPI's justice reform work, we seek to shrink the footprint of the justice system by advocating through coalitions to really re-engineer systems to focus on a continuum of care instead of just pure enforcement. And so our work has really been to reshape juvenile probation. And we've had a recent victory with $75 million being appropriated or to be reallocated to create a Department of Youth Development that'll focus more on a continuum of care, will focus on healing and addressing the needs of youth as opposed to punitive measures. And so there's a likelihood that juvenile probation can be ended in LA County. And that is huge. And that is due to work of many advocates, UPI being a part of one of the main advocacy groups that have been pushing and working to do that. And for those of you who have done work in the county, you really have to have patience. You really have to have an iron ear, and you really have to hold people accountable and keep people on track. It's very difficult to work. And we've had a lot of funding partners that helped us, the wind beneath our wings, like Liberty Hill and Wellness Foundation, Weingart Foundation, TCE, that really support the work that we're doing and make this movement what it is today. And it's the support from funders has been critical in order for us to really create these platforms and to really shift systems to address the needs and hold them accountable to the needs of the community. So, I mentioned Measure J, which is about 10% of the county budget that'll be redirected to create community-based alternatives to law enforcement and try to end the over-reliance on law enforcement. That's huge. The work that George Gascon is doing, a lot of the advocates, UPI included, trying to support what he is doing, things that we've been asking for a long time. And I think it's critical to figure out ways to support some of those policies as there's pushback to them. Even with, I have some friends at Olin Law that are doing work to get people out, to get people paroled. And people are excited behind the walls to say, hey, look, because these gang enhancements and all these other enhancements, I've been down 29 years. And you know what? Now I finally have some action, right? There's some hope that I can actually get out because of these draconian laws that have put me in there through gang profiling. So those are things that we're addressing. We also have a community lawyering piece that focuses on ending gang profiling. So we have a small group of clients that we work with around gang injunctions and CalGang database. And a recent win as well, LAPD agreed to not use the CalGang database anymore recently. But also we had a lawsuit that we won against the city of LA regarding gang injunctions. And so we're on that pathway of ending these gang profiling laws that don't necessarily keep the community safe, but really focus on punitive measures as opposed to really looking at a continuum of care and really rebuilding our communities. And so we hope this work can really set the tone for the country. I think as a lot of people look at LA County and California and the criminal justice reform movement, that the work that we're doing is critical. I mean, in partnership with many different organizations that are really strong advocates, we can really shift how these systems address the needs of our communities. And the last thing I'll touch on, because I think Connie will go more deeply into this, is the Community Safety Partnership. So we provide training and technical assistance to LAPD to prepare officers to work at the Community Safety Partnership sites throughout the city of LA. So there's about 10 sites currently, and those sites we prepare officers to build relationships with the community. So before a CSP site is launched, we do a community-based needs assessment. In that community-based needs assessment, we build relationships, we listen to the community needs, we put them into a report, we present it back to the community and to LAPD saying, before you enter this community, you need to understand the history, you need to understand what the needs are, you need to understand who the leaders are, and you need to understand what the relationship has been like, what their experience has been like with LAPD. Because if you are going to transform how you approach communities and how you police them, and you want to police them more humanely and build public trust, you have to understand what their needs are. But that alone, having officers in these communities alone is not going to change the dynamics. There needs to be seismic investment in building community capacity to engage in conversations with LAPD, to hold LAPD accountable, and really create some mutual relationships that's going to ensure that the community feels safe and that LAPD is there not as occupiers, but as guardians. Within the context of the larger public safety conversation where we're building infrastructures around community health workers, gang intervention, hospital-based intervention workers, mental health first responders, as well as homeless outreach specialists who can engage the hardest to reach populations. So with that, Urban Peace Institute, right now we are in the process of growing and expanding. As you can imagine, our budget has grown tremendously over the past year, given the needs. But also we are currently fiscally sponsored by community partners, and we're working to separate from our fiscal sponsor. And so of course we're always looking for support, but also in order to separate, we're also building our advisory board. And so if you all know anyone who's interested, or if you yourself are interested, please get in contact with us. We'd love to just continue having conversations, because as Connie will always say, that it's very difficult to find people that understand this work and that can support it. And so when we look for board members, we really want folks that want to support this, but then also, have a level of understanding of this work. And so thank you for your time, and I appreciate it, and we'll hand it over to Connie.
To Connie, the digital dunce who doesn't know how to unmute her
I did
screen.
want to jump in for 1 second here, Fernando. I think we forgot to play our Fun Peacemakers video. If we want to go back to that for 1 moment, and then we'll have Connie speak.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah.
In partnership with Chapter 2, Urban Peace Institute was able to help pull together a food and toy drive so that community had access to resources during the holidays.
If law enforcement say, we can't lock our way up out of here, we can't keep building prisons because it don't work, then we sit down at the table and it's shown and proven that this is working and this is saving a life.
I gotta work 3 jobs, right? So I don't only work for Chapter 2, and then I go to work from 11 to 8:30 in the morning.
There was more support systems, if there was higher pay, if there's better access to benefits, we could really build a more robust infrastructure.
We don't get paid enough for what we do because we on call 24/7. I'm putting my life on the line, not just with COVID. When we jump in the middle of intervention work, man, it's a possibility we can get killed.
We do need it funded, and I appreciate anybody funding intervention. Intervention saves lives.
So those are our partners at Chapter 2. We have a grid contract to provide gang intervention services in South LA, and Chapter 2 is our subcontractor who are on the front lines, and we've been together for 13 years. And with that, let's hand it back to Connie.
Thanks, Fernando. And thank you to all of you for joining us this morning. What you just heard was the transformation of the violence interruption and the street operations, the on-the-ground neighborhood operations that were designed to transform how we went after violence and trauma in our impacted neighborhoods, our very poorest areas, from Pacoima down to Watts, down to the Harbor. There's an incredible network that Fernando and all of the partners that make up the constellation of gang intervention and violence interrupters, their work is really quite astounding. Go back 30 years, 20 years, 15 years ago, I remember telling Barry, I can't protect the guys. The cops saw gang intervention, former gang members, current gang members, as their enemies in war. And we had, we couldn't make the political room, the physical room for them to do what Urban Peace just described for you, all of this operation. The transformation began when some of us, I realized that the lawsuits were necessary, the marching is necessary, the legislation is necessary, the report writing, all of that stuff is good. All of the reforms and qualified immunity and bias training and all of that stuff is critical and has to be done. And in the context of the incredible movement that was launched by the Black Lives Matter protests last year in response to the George Floyd police murder, the police murdering George Floyd, what you've created now, what they've created now from a hashtag to an international movement is the energy, the public energy that transformed the national discussion. And 100 years of our lawsuits could not have done that. Now, what, a year, 18 months later, what we're looking at is the state of American policing. The frame for me is the McCone report. 55 years ago, the post-riot audit of the 1965 Los Angeles riots, race riots, triggered by the police. That report said you have to do two things. And the purpose of that report was to say, how do we prevent this from happening again? And the frame that that report set out was twofold. Number one, you fix your police, make them stop being occupiers and hostile sort of dragnet blankets that suppress and contain the community and create alienation. Go to community policing, number one. And number two, you have to also end what the McCone Commission called the spiral of despair. The community conditions of entrenched poverty, disinvestment, dysfunctional government, no institutions, no contract with government that works. And in its place, you have the despair that comes from no hope, no opportunity, no resources, no investment. So that report set out the duality of this mission of how do we get these communities that are so beset by violence, trauma, violence from the community, but also violence from police. How do you transform that? Well, you had to assess what we had. And in American policing, as Fernando alluded to, and even Chief Bratton agrees, the racial corruption, the corruption of American policing began with slavery. I was on a panel with Chief Bratton maybe a week ago, and well, no, more than that, 3 weeks ago. And he was asked, where did the racial corruption begin? And he said 1619. The very first cops were the police who enforced order in the slave holds of the slave ships. And it's gone forward from there, as Fernando sketched out. And so I start with the idea, especially after I learned that while we were suing LAPD and the sheriffs and all kinds of other police departments, Barry and I and Carol and Paul Hoffman, ACLU and MALDEF and NAACP Legal Defense Fund, there was an entire police misconduct bar with Carol Watson and Hugh Manis. I mean, just an incredible array of very talented lawyers who went after policing because the litigation was the only way to hold police abuse accountable. Litigation can stop the abuse, but it can't change how police think. And the lesson that I learned when I told Barry, I said, I have to go inside because I can't protect the interventionists anymore. The police are gunning for them and they're gunning for people like me. And so we had to transform enough of police culture to get police to see allies in the community, not enemies. And you had to find the change agents inside the police departments. And it began with Chief Bratton. Continued with Chief Beck, and now with Chief Moore. And out of that 15-year journey through policing, here's what I learned. We get the policing that the larger political institutions ask for. What we tell police is in our thin blue line paradigm of policing, which means the police are the thin blue line between good communities and communities that are not good. The communities on the right side of the thin blue line get safety. The communities on the wrong side of the thin blue line, Watts, Pacoima, all of our pockets of trauma and violence and desperation and lack of opportunity. Those communities are to be contained, suppressed, and they receive mass incarceration enforcement. What one former gang officer described his policing, he said, Connie, what we do is we do search and destroy. And I looked for the cops who understood that their role wasn't to help the community. It wasn't to bring safety to these violence and high crime zones. It was to make sure that the violence and the misery stayed contained. Their mission is to containment, suppression, enforcement. We wanted them to go from that to 180 degrees to wrap around neighborhood safety. Stop locking up every kid in baggy pants, every kid who has to join a gang in order to survive so that his little sister doesn't get gang raped when he tells the Grape Street Crips no. Kids, a lot of these kids have no choice but to join La Vida Loca, to join the gangs. We've left these children in violent zones. And I started going inside the police department because I realized they're the power in this entire set of dysfunctions. If you can harness the police power, you can harness the change that's needed. You can harness transformation. Otherwise, they'll keep arrests, they'll do whack-a-mole arrests and mass incarceration enforcement that just destroys the community through mass incarceration, suppression. They're not providing safety. They're providing crushing control. And that's what the larger society says. You make sure those people don't get to my neighborhood. It's in all of our institutions. When we did the MTA case, we found the memos that show they actually made sure the bus lines from Watts stopped exactly too far away so that Black people could not walk to the beach. So all of our institutions still perpetrate the infrastructure of institutional and systemic racism. In policing, it's more visible. And so what I began was a journey to make the police our partners. And with Bill Bratton, we began to see at least the top of policing, because people ask, what the hell has changed in policing, Connie, when you say it's not your grandfather's LAPD? What I mean is that the executive level of American policing has changed. It has not changed the DNA of the shock and awe enforcement culture, the warrior culture, the gladiator mindset of police that you saw reacting to peaceful protests this summer. They had their batons out, they were ready for war. That's the gladiator mentality. And what we went in for was to get the chiefs to understand that you can do crush and control enforcement, but you're not bringing down the murder rate. You spent $34 billion in a war on drugs and a war on gangs, and you have 6 times as many gang members and 100,000 gang members and six times as many gangs. That's utter failure. You've actually created criminogenic. You have enforcement policies that actually create more violence, more crime, more trauma. So we went in at them at an effectiveness level that they had to tell the police, look at what you're doing. You count success as how many arrests, how many children you put into the gang database, how many folks go to prison. What if you flip that and asked, instead of how many can you incarcerate, what if you asked, why don't you get promoted for how many children you keep out of the prison pipeline? Why don't you get rewarded for creating wraparound public health safety and participating in getting this community healthier? And it was Chief Beck who first said to me, after a traumatic incident in Jordan Downs housing project, and I went down to the headquarters and I said, this has got to stop. There was a family that was tortured before they could even get their belongings moved into the new unit in Jordan Downs. And what I realized was that all of our lawsuits, all of our policies, all of our papers had not kept that family from being tortured by the gang. We had gang-controlled housing projects. We had violent gangs controlling the parks, the libraries, the pools, all of the public spaces. There was no safety. Latino families didn't feel like they could even sit out on the little concrete slab they call the stoops in the public housing projects. And when I realized children could not walk to school safely, they were not safe in the hallways of Jordan Downs High School or Markham Middle School or any of the inner city traumatized community schools. And what I realized as a civil rights lawyer was, what the hell were we doing? If kids couldn't even walk to school safely, what were we doing? We were not only failing to provide safety, we weren't even providing the basics of basic functionality in a neighborhood. And so with that as a backdrop, we started on a venture to flip the paradigm from mass incarceration, search and destroy enforcement to wrap around safety strategies. Enforcement is not safety. And as a civil rights lawyer, the light bulb that went on for me was that, what's the first civil right? It's the right to be safe. And the first freedom is freedom from violence. And what was I doing winning case after case when my clients were dying one after another? So that's what the flip was, the transformation to go from shock and awe, search and destroy enforcement in neighborhoods on the wrong side of the thin blue line, and the thin blue line warrior gladiator policing paradigm for policing, and switch it 180 degrees to safety guardianship. And it was Chief Beck who said, okay, Connie, I want to know. I don't want to know how many arrests they can rack up. I don't want to know how many drug houses they can bash the doors in. I don't want to know how many people we sent to prison. I want to know, can my cops create trust with the people who hate us in these poor underclass communities? They hate us, and with good reason. I want to know, can I create trust with these communities? Is it even possible? And if it is, Can we bond together to help cops? Can my cops help this community become healthy? Because when you send police into an unhealthy community, you get what we see. So it was Chief Beck's vision of wraparound health policing, safety policing, and we co-created the Community Safety Partnership. It was the only demonstration of guardianship policing, of wraparound safety policing, of police who get rewarded for helping the community get healthier, for helping the community get organized, to get resources for itself, to help the community empower itself to keep itself safe, to help the community, help the cops reduce their footprint, and to help the community get other agencies to respond together as integrated whole of government partners in wraparound strategies. Now, it's a lot of jargon, but what it means is the cops are no longer in the business of measuring their success through mass incarceration, new Jim Crow machinery. They left that and created an entirely new apparatus with the community as partners. And what we found was, because Chief Beck didn't create this model with us as a crime reduction. He said, I don't care about crime reduction. I want to know, can we generate trust? I want to know, can we generate safety? I want to know, can I get cops who don't shoot anybody in the gang zones? Can we transform the gang cult of death into a culture of violence and eruption? And I don't want my cops locking up all of the gang interventionists anymore. I want them to do foot patrols. I want my cops out of the cars. I want to do smart cars, where I have mental health counselors, public health people, social workers, all in a car, and there's a racer radio, and if they get in trouble, the cops will back them up, but they're the first responders. Charlie Beck was the first chief to demand, he gave 90 cars, they were called smart cars, and the county was supposed to give the workers to be the first responders, and it worked for a little while until the unions decided that they didn't want their workers out on Skid Row at 2 in the morning because it was too dangerous. So we actually did what the advocates of the movement, the international movement to end police brutality, to end the shootings of unarmed African Americans that we see in those atrocious snuff film police videos. How do you get humane, compassionate policing to replace the inhumane, warrior, containment, suppression, mass incarceration, destruction of search and destroy policing? So the Community Safety Partnership was the first chief of police backed transformation of policing culture, from warrior to guardian, from predator to cops who invest in the safety and health of the community. And 14 years later, UCLA has just evaluated the Community Safety Partnership, and there was an evaluation conducted by Dr. Georgia Leap. And what the Luskin School of Public Affairs found, and you can go on their website and find the evaluation, was that Community Safety Partnership created trust between poor public housing residents and the Community Safety Partnership police. A Community Safety Partnership site is selected, evaluated, assessed. The community members sit at the table and co-craft the wraparound safety plan, and they ask the Community Safety Partnership to come into their community so that they can get rid of the search and destroy police and have safety police instead. But the partnership, the community does foot patrols along with intervention. The police are rewarded for knowing every kid's name, who needs help with their medications. Yes, these police do make arrests, but only for violence, not for status crimes, not for drug crimes, as long as they're not dealing to kids. They go after predators and they go after violence. So they can be warrior cops when they need to, but this model of policing is a partnership with community leaders, both formal and informal. It is a whole of government, all hands on deck, get in the boat and row to carry out this safety strategy. And you have mental health counselors, social workers, teachers, you have all of the stakeholders in a community, and they get together. The Watts Gang Task Force is the body that does it in the Watts area. In Ramona Gardens, there's a whole council of community stakeholders that work with community safety police in that site. So it is a whole of government safety strategy that is based in public health principles, violence reduction principles, and population safety principles. And these are the cops that in this evaluation, over 2,000 of the residents who have lived with community safety partnership policing and know the difference between those cops and the traditional enforcement shock and awe cops, they report that community safety partnership increases the trust that they have with these cops, has made them feel safer. There's actual increases in safety. It bridges the black-brown divides. And all 2,000 of the residents who were interviewed as part of this evaluation and who have been partners in carrying out this model of policing safety have said, this is what we want. We don't want police gone because that means the gangs take over. What we want are police who respect us, police who are invested in our safety, in our health, and in our growth, and in our success. We want the cops to help us thrive. Right now, we're in a spiral of despair, but we need cops who care about us and our children. And that is the vision, because one old gang cop I recruited to be a community safety partnership officer, the very first class, he said, "Lady, this is the craziest shit I've ever heard. We're not social workers. What the hell is your vision?" And I said, my vision, standing next to Chief Beck, I said, my vision is that when you see a dark-skinned Black boy or a little Latino boy in Jordan Downs housing project, you will no longer look at him and think, I get to arrest him in 4 years. And if he keeps going with the gang, I get to kill him. And if I do a righteous shoot, I'll look tough for SWAT and I'll be selected for SWAT first. Instead of looking at a dark-skinned Black kid as fodder for your shock and awe mass incarceration Jim Crow crap, you will look at that kid and you will say, he's mine and I want him to succeed. Chief Beck jumped up and said, you know, Connie, she's a civil rights lawyer, she talks that way. But Chief Beck basically said, we want to be part of this community and not the reason that it's dying. So where are we now? 14 years later, we almost lost CSP because the baton didn't get passed. Chief Moore, after he understood what it was, that it was radically different, it's 180 degrees from Gladiator to Guardian, is a big arc of change. And it's very threatening to police because it requires communication, it requires problem solving, it requires bonding with people a lot of cops are afraid of. It requires engaging with gang members and all of the folks who, if you're not given an alternative to be positive actors, are negative actors who tear down the community. It requires bringing in resources. It requires carrying out a safety strategy that is tailored to that community and co-developed with people who live in that community. It is a radical, radical format for a very different kind of policing. It allows for first responders. It makes police a positive force in areas of despair. Where we are now is when the marches started, when the protests started and Dr. Leap's evaluation came out. Dr. Leap's evaluation said, not only is this the future of American policing, because the communities, the impacted communities say it is, but it is also the future for these communities. And what she found was, she said, you need to give it a place of power, because inside of LAPD, they were trying to kill it. They called it women's policing. And I said, yes, it is women's policing. It's smart, communicative, it solves problems, and it gets the job done without killing people. Call it women's policing all you want. That is not a pejorative. That's a compliment. It is women's policing. And I said, it's more effective in crime solving. The thing that killed the Gladiator cops was that at Comstat, where they do measure arrests, they do measure how many people they send to prison. They don't measure safety. They don't measure how many kids they kept out of the prison pipeline like the CSP cops do. But what was really infuriating to the shock and awe old-fashioned traditional enforcement cops was that the CSP crime stats were better than the traditional enforcement crime reduction stats. Who knew that trust was a better weapon to reduce crime than arrests and mass incarceration? That was the magic. We did not expect that. And that's what the evaluation showed. And what Dr. Leap said was, you have to protect CSP inside of a hostile culture of traditional enforcement, it has to have its own division. Well, when the protests came, Chief Moore and a group of us decided a division isn't enough. There has to be an entire bureau. So this summer, the city council Mayor Garcetti, Chief Moore, all together erected the first and only entire policing bureau dedicated to guardian policing. So you can come out as an academy graduate and do nothing but guardianship all the way up to chief. We have carved out a space inside the power structure and infrastructure of LAPD. And it was a tough thing to do for both the chief, the mayor, and the city council, because the pressure was on the paradigm of defund, don't defund. That to me is a red herring. It is about refunding the communities that have been defunded for 60 years now. So people have asked, what's the solution? How come we can't get any change? Connie, we're taking their weapons away. Connie, we're changing qualified immunity and doing more lawsuits. All of the stuff that the advocates are asking for is good stuff to ask for, but it will not change how cops think. The thing that I've learned, the only thing that changes how cops think, how they apply their judgment, how they calibrate their responses to threats, is changing the mindset and the mission, the metrics, and the context in which policing is done. We have to reposition policing so that it can be a positive force in partnership with community. Because right now their mission is toxic. Their mission is containment, suppression. That mission has not changed from slavery to today. And until you have a lot of good people in policing, and I know the advocates don't like to hear this. I know because I've represented a lot of those officers. I know because I've been riding shotgun with them for 20 years now. I know because I've been with the chiefs who have struggled to transform policing at the top. The reason it didn't help George Floyd and didn't get to Rodney King's neighborhood is because we haven't touched the DNA of policing. CSP touches the DNA and the RNA of the shock and awe mass incarceration enforcement and transforms it 180 degrees. So until you change the gladiator mindset to a guardian mindset, until you change the mission from shock and awe, search and destroy, mass incarceration enforcement to wrap around safety and community building, you will not see a change in the judgment of cops. Their threat assessment and their judgments will still produce shootings of unarmed African Americans and others. It will still produce death and destruction and increase death and destruction in these communities. And it will also continue to endanger police. Police are also traumatized by this gladiator model. The problem is it's a problem of identity. Cops like thinking that they're war heroes. They like the Rambo model. They think that they're superheroes, and they like that macho, mindless force. They like the toys, they like the sirens, they like the chases. CSP is about human beings, not about the shock and awe culture of hyper-masculine alpha male, dumb arrest policing. And when you introduce a model like CSP, it's like COVID being introduced in the body. The traditional culture tries to kill it. So it's a battle every day to preserve this place. Now, Chief Moore, like Chief Beck, has said that we're making more room for this. We want the mindset and the attitude of CSP, if not the full wraparound strategy, because you only do the full wraparound strategy in communities that are racked by violence, gang control, and trauma. That super investment has to be contained to the sites. You can't spread it. You can spread the mentality through the culture of the rest of LAPD, and that's what the community wants. So I'll stop there, and I know that people are wondering what did the protest produce? What's it really going to take to change policing? I think Fernando and Urban Peace and all of their allies, there's a coalition of they work in networks and coalitions, and the institutions that we created out of that 12-pound report, the grid, that's unique. They're setting up one in Chicago. We have to create the architecture and the infrastructure for violence reduction and wraparound safety in communities that are at the bottom of the well. I'm not talking about all of LA. I'm talking about what has to happen to keep what happened to George Floyd. What is that mentality in policing that is so dehumanizing, so destructive, so brutal, and so violent? How do you unwind that? How do you unwind that? You do CSP. And I'll stop there and take questions.
Thank you so much, Connie. We already had some questions during your presentation, but I want to allow some time for everyone to type some more questions in the chat if they'd like to be called on. I also have some of these questions ready to present to you and Fernando, and I'll also let Barry chime in here right now as well.
So,
And I did want to mention, though, if you would like to state your question, if you'd like to be actually called on and speak, please note that in the chat with your question so we know to let you get called on.
all right, so I wanted to raise a question, which I think certainly been on my mind, and I think it's probably on other people's minds, which is, one, to what extent right now within LAPD is the CSP model operative in the communities that need it? And more importantly, what needs to be done in real world terms to like move that model forward? And how does that deal with, how do the unions play into that? Because I know that there's a lot of issues from the unions. So this is either for Fernando or Connie.
Well, I'll answer. You asked, how is CSP being treated right now? Because Chief Moore and the mayor and the council followed the recommendation to create a bureau. There is a power platform within the Darwinian power culture of LAPD. And Chief Moore, I was 2 days ago, we were on the wraparound, the sort of brain trust that is launching this bureau. And you got to understand, this bureau is structured on there is a deputy chief. Her name is Imada Tengarides, and she is an African-American woman who grew up in Watts. She grew up around those housing projects. And also there is a civilian deputy chief who is an administrative counterpart to Chief Tengarides. So you have a civilian deputy inside of LAPD co-directing and co-controlling the development of this policing. So the partnership is modeled in the actual structure. The community partnership is modeled in the structure of the bureau. There's nothing like it, and there's no other bureau like it in LAPD. So right now, it is continuing to be protected, but it took a struggle to get the new policing administration to engage and actually have a light bulb go on and understand what it was, because we hadn't codified it. There was no manual, there were no white papers. All of that's being done in the wake of the evaluation that Dr. Leap did at UCLA. So it's now is protectable, Barry, that the model is protectable. But let me tell you, it will remain embattled because it threatens the very identity of most police officers. And letting go, like anything that they think is women are soft. I mean, the misogyny and is almost as great as the anti-Black racism and other kinds of xenophobia that you find in American policing, that we saw on full display with their participation in the MAGA insurrection. You have now the possibility of we've saved the baby from being strangled in the cradle. I'll put it that way. I'll put it that way. And it's clicking on full cylinders. That I was astonished at that meeting. Even the heads of the gang units were on that call, reporting into how their coordination and partnership with the CSP officers. The CSP officers didn't have any trouble getting partners in the community, but they had terrible trouble getting police partners. So the gang units would undo the community safety partnership community plans. They would sabotage them. They would denigrate them in the squad room. They would make jokes about them at roll call. So they were in a hostile crucible inside of LAPD, even when Beck was chief. Now I'm seeing gang supervisors and sort of, the shock and awe units. They're now coordinating with the CSP. So that's hopeful. I don't know if we're going to be able to protect CSP over the long haul, but it's at least now positioned to have some staying power. But understand that the reason that this policing and the unions, let me tell you, this is all you need to know about the unions. It's the beating heart of Americans' fascist wing of policing. Very, very regressive, reactionary. And when Chief Beck, in trying to promote and reward de-escalation, we had to have a battle over de-escalation. Don't, just put that in your pipe and contemplate. But really, pause on this. Chief Beck created a Preservation of Life Award. Barry, Preservation of Life. The union grieved. They objected to a Preservation of Life Award. That's really all you need to know about the reactionary culture of the unions. And it's the reactionary culture of the unions that creates the infrastructure of impunity. You remember when Derek Chauvin was looking into the camera as his knee was crushing the life out of George Floyd, and he looked in that phone camera, and the look in his eyes said, yeah, I get to do this. I get to do this because nothing's going to happen to me. The reason he has that impunity is because he knows there's not going to be a prosecution. The Bill of Rights that a lot of the unions go after, they insulate, they protect perjurers, the cops who lie on the stand. Do you realize in LA County, a judge can't even ask if a cop has been convicted of perjury or has been caught, had to be pulled from the stand because he lied on the stand before in another case? Judges can't. The prosecutors don't even know if the cops, they've wrapped themselves in so many shields so to the extent that they feel like they can actually murder on camera and not face any consequences. That's one of the planks of police transformation. Yes, you go to guardianship. Yes, you change the mission, but you also have to dismantle the infrastructure of impunity that is put into police bills of rights that reach too far and protect police. They actually have a say in discipline. I'm a lawyer. I don't get to determine which rules of discipline control my conduct as a member of the bar. Lawyers don't, doctors don't get to control the standards and decide whether a doctor has those standards applied to malpractice. No, but police do. They control the discipline rules. That's the shield of impunity that does have to come down for systemic change. So I don't know if this kind of policing can ever get hold broadly, not in the next 10 years, but we've taken it from a demonstration to a bureau inside of a police department that is a cultural pace setter for American policing. This isn't some easy department. If you can take a paramilitary organization like LAPD and have it pioneer the guardian policing, which, by the way, military leaders say is what's needed. It's not just civil rights lawyers like us. If you can get that kind of backing for it, I brought in General McChrystal, and I brought in Colonel McIntyre, who is JSOC's safety populations. Strange to think that warriors have to think about, keeping populations safe. But it was the military's endorsement of this wraparound safety policing that allowed LAPD's culture to have it happen. It wouldn't have been enough for just lawyers like Barry and me and advocates like Paula and Liberty Hill say it. They won't take it from us. It has to come from police are the only ones that can change policing. They need help from folks like us. They need partners to tell them how to do it because they honestly don't know how to do it, even the cops who want to change. And you have to create the political room and the backup that supports them branching out into something that for police is terrifying. Doing foot patrols with the guys you used to arrest 10 years ago is terrifying. Getting out of your squad car and talking to poor Black people you're terrified of, not easy. But after 14 years, we know this doesn't just work. It changes the police, it changes the communities, it changes the gang intervention culture, and it transforms those housing projects, which were just pits of despair, they've changed. Ask the residents. And it's not just, you have to focus on helping the police to change themselves, because no outsiders can do it. I think Barry and I both know that. The litigation is critical because it's the floor. But this is about hearts and minds, not the floor, not the stopping of abuses, but the creation of policing that actually helps these communities, communities we have left behind, communities we have defunded, help them heal, get reinvested in, and build. So I'm sorry, let me shut up.
Thank you so much, Connie. I have some other questions coming. I have one person who does want to be called on, so I want to make sure we get to them. It's Cynthia Anderson Barker.
Yes, thank you, Connie. This is just a wonderful, wonderful program today. And I hope we can continue having discussions like this. So I'm a lawyer. I work with the Lawyers Guild. And yes, I've been involved in all the protest litigation. But like you, I've evolved in my thinking from litigation not being a real tool or strategy to looking at the policy issues. So you talked about the police unions and the problems there. But I wanted to ask you about when an officer enters the academy, the screening procedures. And I know, of course, once, even if you get a good officer entering the academy because you have a great screening tool, once they're in the culture of law enforcement, that might change everything when they had started out with the right mentality. So that's one issue I'd like address, academy and the screening, and then civil service rules that protect law enforcement from discipline, from accountability. How could those be changed? And then I just want to talk about an incident a couple of days ago at the Black Lives Matter protest. At the Gascon hearing, Black Lives Matter did a press conference supporting Gascon regarding the DA's effort to shut down Gascon's reforms. So at the protest, what happened was an agitator came in, tried to push some people around. And then what happened, the LAPD took that agitator aside, which was good. They were taken out of the crowd. But then the LAPD let the agitator make a citizen's complaint, and 3 Black Lives Matter protesters were arrested. So where is CSP or that mentality when it comes to interacting with the protest movement, which right now it's a vast movement and protests are happening weekly, bi-weekly. So where's the LAPD's arm to de-escalate there?
I want to jump in one question too. We can incorporate. I also getting some questions how we might train and what Urban Peace Institute's role is in training the community safety partnership officers as well. That can be tied in.
Yeah, and I won't remember most of these questions, but but
Sorry.
Cynthia,
I'll take on the training, but Connie, you can take on the
yeah, Cynthia,
the
you're
first piece.
absolutely right. The civil service also is part of the iron, the shields from the impunity shields. But in terms of the selection, you bring up a really important. You realize that Derek Chauvin was a training officer. He was training recent graduates of the Minneapolis Academy and how to police in poor Black communities. And they may learn the right principles in the academy. Most of the academy training, if you looked at the manuals and whatnot, we could criticize some things, but it's not what it was 30 years ago. The manuals are training. And you've had a lot, Chief Sandy Jo MacArthur under Bratton changed a lot of the training. The problem is they haven't changed the training officers. They're still the old guard, graveyard shift sergeants who tell the academy graduates, forget whatever you learned in the academy. I'm going to teach you how to stay alive on these streets. That bullshit you learned in the academy has got nothing to do with what we face out here. So shut up and watch what I do. Derek Chauvin was a training officer. So you've got this disconnect between what the top of the culture, the police executive level, which has changed and can finish our sentences to a large degree, not every chief, but of the major city police chiefs, you've got a lot of them in there that have embraced CSP or other kinds of guardianship models. They've changed. What hasn't changed is the main body of the thinking and the culture and the norms and the values of the more militaristic paramilitary culture. And it's a matter of infiltration. Creating a bureau, if people see that the chiefs are being chosen from that bureau, that's the incentive structure. Because once you flip the incentive structure, you can get the behavior to change. The cops who wanted to be guardians, they came to policing. You talk about how they were selected. They came to policing to change it. They were the African American and Latino residents of these neighborhoods who got stopped by the cops and said, you know what, I'm going in this department to change it because I don't like the way they treat us. So Imada Tingarides, who grew up in and around Watts, has always had the guardian heart. And she came. I recruited, along with Charlie Beck, former gang cops, white gang cops, who were shock and awe to the core. We wanted them to try this because if you could turn them, you could have a shot at changing the DNA of the culture. So it's a matter of who gets promoted. Right now, the incentive structure is to look tough, get a righteous shoot, and get selected for SWAT as a specialized unit. Cynthia, until that incentive structure changes, Charlie Beck started flipping the incentive structure. You're going to get rewarded for de-escalating. You're going to get an award for not shooting when you could have. You're going to get a reward for helping a community heal and get resources. You're going to get rewarded for counting the children you actually diverted from the pipeline. 180 degrees different. Once those values can get injected into the mainstream, the bloodstream of the body of LAPD, you start to have something. We're seeing it, but it's going to be slow. Don't forget that the criteria for selection haven't caught up with the challenges. And right now, policing is in a state of war. And it's hard to get internal change when they are in their bunkers. They're talking about eliminating Black Lives Matter like they eliminated the Black Panthers. I'm talking about most of the white cops, about 40% of the Latino cops who are invested in the whiteness wing of police and culture, the traditional paramilitary infrastructure that does shock and awe and crush and control enforcement. So you're right. There hasn't been enough change throughout those streams of DNA inside of LAPD. And the rest of it, I'll hand to Fernando.
So it's just important also to understand. So CSP is I think currently at 10 sites. The most recent one is in San Fernando Gardens. So about a little over 100 CSP officers that are part of the bureau. So it's nascent, right? And before there was a bureau was even erected, there was conversation about if the LAPD is serious about taking this to scale, LAPD needed internal infrastructure in order to support those 100 officers. Where do they fit within the LAPD org chart, right? Which is huge. So that's really important. So the creation of the bureau helped create a backbone to help institutionalize and support this type of work, right? And so for us, it's a test for the chief, it's a test for the department on are they serious about changing their culture? And we're going to see. And if you really want to dig into this, the CSP evaluation, it's on our website. You could read into it, and you know what some of the challenges were, right? Model fidelity was one of the biggest challenges. You know, the first set of officers who were trained, you know, they were like the pioneers trying to figure out how to balance enforcement versus relationship-based policing. And so part of the training that we do for all officers is really focused on relationship-based policing. We talk to them about a comprehensive strategy. The chief will come in, Connie will come in, kind of lay it out. And one of the things I remember from the first training, and Connie told the story when she said, this is my vision and this is what I want. And they're treating her like a chief. But they said, when she said, I want you to treat brown and black boys as if they're your own, there was a gasp in the room. It felt like the air left the room. And all the officers in there were like, whoa. And it was a surreal moment for them because they said, whoa, are we really going to do this? Because the training has always been us versus them, right? That shock and awe, command and control. And so that shift is important. And when we do the training, what we do is we bring residents in so there's a warm handoff. So not only before they go in, does there need to be an assessment, because we have to prepare the community for it and make sure the community wants it, but also we have to prepare LAPD officers. But when we train, we bring in the resident leaders that have worked with us on the assessment, and we bring them to meet the officers so that they can have conversations about the housing development or the park or the neighborhood that they're going to be working in together. And then part of that is really having council offices in the city really step up to be the conveners of safety collaboratives in the community. A lot of times, if LAPD leads those safety collaboratives, it's a top-down approach, right? LAPD ends up really moving the narrative and moving the agenda. But when you have council offices, or you even have strong community capacity or infrastructures that can lead it and really establish mutual accountability, that's where you will see more CSP traction in those areas. CSP is not going to work if there's not community capacity, community leadership that is willing to have the hard conversations with LAPD to hold LAPD accountable, but then LAPD has to hold the community accountable to the agreements around what this partnership is really about. And I think the key word is really partnership. But in a partnership, it cannot be a one of those relationships where it's top down. It has to be at a level of equality. And when we get to, in order to get to having an equal conversation, you have to develop leadership and capacity of communities in order to hold their ground with law enforcement. And that's what we've been seeing. And that's why we do community capacity building with the Leadership Institute, but also that's why we train officers to prepare them when they go out into the community.
And Cynthia, the CSP officers were not on the skirmish lines. And had they been assigned to the protest response, which I thought was asked backwards, there was no planning with the community. The reaction, I think, that you saw on television was because of hostility to the message. They didn't like what the protesters were protesting. Notice the difference, and I was just in an FBI briefing last week, which has done they said they know this much, that the threat assessment for the MAGA insurrection was that MAGA is okay as long as BLM isn't going to counter protest. And that's the only danger that this constellation of right-wing extremists posed. They completely underestimated the threat because they identified with the message. Many of them identify with MAGA. And in fact, I've heard white cops talking about, I thought MAGA liked us. So the assessment for the Black Lives Matter peaceful protests, and the assessments in the cities are that the killings and the fires that happened in the wake at night of the peaceful daytime protests were not done by any Black Lives Matter protesters. They were done by Boogaloo Boys in one case, Proud Boys in another case, and anarchists. And I don't know what the naked white woman was about, but anyway, it wasn't Black Lives Matter. So when you ask where the CSP officers were, CSP officers are site-based because the model, the full metal jacket model, is for the sites where communities are suffering epidemic trauma and violence. You have to inject, when traditional programs and policies aren't enough, you bring in the full cavalry, the multi-sectored county agents. Well, the full model would have county agencies, but that's where we need to aim our guns, which is the county and the city agencies are not doing cross-silo, get in the boat, wrap around partnerships. They're still sitting in their offices in front of their screens doing reports for staff meetings instead of being on the ground with these CSP community councils that actually carry out safety strategies. So you wouldn't find CSP officers on the skirmish lines. And when you see cops making a skirmish line, that means they're in paramilitary mode. There isn't going to be any communication, and they're about to unleash a whole bunch of whoop ass on some demonstrators. So they went, that's, instead of sitting down with the leaders and with the political leaders to say these protests are coming, let's understand what it's about. And for the police not to have that visceral reaction against saying, protest against their culture and their policies and the way they behave in these communities, they had a visceral reaction. And that's what you saw in the difference between the response to the MAGA insurrection and the Black Lives Matter.
Thank you. And that's what I saw 2 days ago when the LAPD just chased down the Black Lives Matter protesters who were leaving the press conference supporting Gascon. So thank you, Connie.
Thank you so much. I got some questions a while back about more details on the Fund Peacemakers campaign. Specifically, how many gang intervention workers does the Urban Peace Institute work with? What exactly is our funding amount we're advocating for? and maybe some details around where we're trying to get that funding from, public or private sources. So I think I'm going to give it to Fernando since we are at a pivotal moment in that campaign.
Thank you, Caitlin. So I like to say, we like to say on a good day, about 120 community intervention workers in the city of LA. The county, very nascent, I would say about 10 to 12 through the Office of Violence Prevention. So the 120 are through the Mayor's Office of Gang Reduction and Youth Development. Our coalition, 16 frontline agencies working together, Black and Brown, that cover the city and some of the county areas, are asking for $54 million to be invested into gang intervention. That includes a minimum salary of $45,000 a year plus benefits, hazard pay, particularly during the pandemic, but also access to flexible funds in order to address the community, some community needs that, because there's restrictions with some of the bureaucratic funds. And we want to go from 120 peacemakers to 500 peacemakers citywide, and go from right now about 36 ambassadors to 250 ambassadors. And ambassadors are kind of one click below intervention workers. They're folks that they get paid stipends monthly to help support peace efforts, but are a recruitment ground in order to build professional peacemakers. And so of the 120 positions that are available for gang intervention, we want to open that up to make more positions available, 500 citywide. And then also we are putting together our county campaign where we're going to ask for hundreds of millions of dollars. How to support is, right now the council's still trying to figure out how they're going to spend the $88 million that's left of the $150 million taken from LAPD. And so if you could reach out to council members, reach out to the mayor, and let them know that you support the Fund Peacemakers campaign. It's on our website for the $54 million to be invested in community-based public safety experts.
Fernando, we actually have a question right now in the chat. If you can scroll over from Bob Blumenfield about how our gang intervention response and the CSP model compares to some of those similar models of the CAHOOTS program with the ununiformed officers and mental health intervention.
Right. So the CAHOOTS model has been getting a lot of attention. I think it's a good model. I don't know too much about it, but what I do know is that mental health, non-law enforcement, right? Mental health responders, that respond to mental health crisis situations, but also they have law enforcement backup. And so that's important. I think it's something that works and could be taken to scale. With gang intervention are, professionally trained safety experts who know the terrain that they are working in. So, as people talk about, if you're going to climb Everest, you need Sherpas, you need people that know their terrain, you need people who are indigenous to the communities. So in order to really build out community-based professionals, the level of investment needs to increase and make it more robust. So the city of LA has scaled up for 10 years. We got up to $32.5 million being invested via the GRID program into these communities. It's dropped down a bit over the years because of budget cuts, but we want to double that. We want to get up to $60 million. And then in the county, we want to get up to $200 million and really have a more regional comprehensive strategy. But it's also going to take a public-private partnership where the public side can focus on core services and the private dollars can be used to innovate and to really broaden out a more regional safety effort that ends the over-reliance on law enforcement and builds community-based structures that can address mental health, can do homeless outreach, work hospitals, community health workers, which is needed right now, and of course, gang intervention and other areas, creating career pathways where families can really not only survive, but thrive and have access to meaningful employment that gives back and to the community and supports the civic infrastructure that needs to be built.
Thank you. I also dropped into the chat, we have partnered with several untraditional allies in this effort to fund peacemakers, including Moms Demand Action, Every Town for Gun Safety, the Hope and Heal Foundation, Women Against Gun Violence, and the United Parents for Teachers in Schools. And together, we're actually emailing the LA City Council right now, urging them to sustain this investment in peacemakers and to help us build their capacity. So if you want to take maybe 30 seconds, if this presentation has moved you so, to let our LA City Council know that you support this effort. I just put the link in there. I think we have answered most of our questions to date. I'm looking. And I know we're a little bit over time, so I'm going to pass it back to Barry. Oh no, I see one more. Is that Shane who wants to speak? Go ahead. And then I'll close it out with Barry after Shane's question is asked and answered.
Hi, this has been amazing. Thank you all so much for everything you're doing. It is such a relief and a deeply just gratifying to see your leadership and how you're taking charge. And I was just curious if you could share about your observations in the current uptick in violence and crime that the LAPD is associating with gang violence, and what do you think is driving that? And obviously, I know you'll say intervention is a key strategy, but just curious, you know, if you could share a little bit more about kind of this moment in time.
I was just at a briefing, what's today, Saturday, earlier this week. The criminologists think that the upticks in crime are primarily due to the crushing impact of COVID. What few avenues out of these communities, these impacted communities, abandoned communities, where they are now shut down. And you've got, you know, in the overcrowded conditions, everything from all of the conditions are made so much worse, and the outlets are gone. The outlets for relief, the outlets, the programs that are keeping, you know, that have increased safety, have increased well-being, they're gone because you can't carry them out. So most of the criminologists are associated. They're seeing the correlation between the upticks in crime, violent crime, correlated with the COVID. The police unions are trying to say it's because you took $100 million out of our $3 billion budget, but that's ridiculous. And they're trying to say that because, you know, you eliminated cash bail, they're going against all of the systemic justice, criminal justice reforms, and trying to, you know, put Velcro on them to say that they're the reason that people are dying. Well, no, that's absurd. So Shane, I think it's the criminologists as their shorthand, very preliminary take, because we're not going to know until we can get further out what the other dynamics are. But the main driver is the pandemic.
So I mean, just speaking to what Connie laid out is, you know, the context. We're experiencing a 100-year pandemic. The country is dealing with this legacy of racism. You have mass protests. You have a white resurgence of a white nationalist movement, and you have economic deprivation, and you have anxiety. So at the ground level, you're going to see that manifest in many ways. So that's where we're seeing the surge in violence. That's why the peacemakers providing food, engagement, access to information are so important. Even during the protests, they were helping kind of mediate some of the protests as well, because some of the Black Lives Matter protesters that were there that weren't from that community, people from that community were having issues with them, and they had to mediate those issues, right? So they were helping, you know, keep the peace even during the protests. But just some stats to share is that gang violence of the 349 homicides last year, 55% were gang related. So there was a 42% increase in gang homicides last year. In CSP zones, violence went down 7%. In grid zones, gang crime dropped 9%. So if you look at those numbers, I mean, and this is, I don't know if the city leaders really understand what that means, right? Because what we're finding when we meet with council offices is they're not really well versed in these stats and really what that really looks like on the ground level. And we need to really expose that. We need to really demonstrate and say, hey, look, the country is watching, right? So with Mayor Garcetti taking $150 million from LAPD, that was seismic. I mean, the people around the country are like, wow, what is LA going to do, right? This is great. Let's see what LA does. And what came out in the budget, in the initial budget proposal, was, you know, a lot of Bureau of Street Services stuff, nothing the intervention really, other than I think one of the council offices was going to fund some safe passage stuff. But it was really an opportunity for city leaders to say, we're really going to reimagine public safety. We're going to invest in communities of color, and we're going to bolster the comprehensive strategy that had helped us achieve a 10-year historic low in violence. But for us, as Chief Beck said at the gang conference, we want to get to zero. And what is that going to take? And as Connie will say, she'll say, you know, $800 million investment in South LA alone is a down payment on what is actually needed to transform our communities. And so we're looking at this surge of violence that's happening across the country. LA is no different, but we do have infrastructures that could be bolstered in order to bring that down and get down below 300, get down below 250, get down to zero. That's the goal. That's the vision.
And to follow up on that investment in community piece, that's the spiral of despair half of the McCone framework. And we haven't engineered upward mobility. For the last 50 years, we've been taking the rungs out of the upward mobility ladder and pushing people down into downward mobility, increased poverty, extreme poverty. And so when you look at this, remember Rebuild LA and the estimates for giving those South LA communities that were racked by the riots, give those set of communities, what would it take to give them the basic institutions, amenities, and services that a functioning neighborhood has? The credit unions, the banks, the grocery stores, the job training sites and clearance sites, just the basic infrastructure. And McKinsey came up with what, 6 billion, which is maybe 10 billion in today's dollars. That's just for that set of neighborhoods. Pacoima is much poorer than South LA. You've got areas in Pacoima where they don't even have paved roads. There's still pockets of Pacoima that aren't connected to the sewer lines. So we've got real poverty up there. So if you were to take the Linwoods, the Maywoods, the poor areas of Watts, the poor pockets of East LA, if you were to take all of the extreme poverty pockets where CSP and a whole, all hands, whole government response is required because the conditions are so bad, that's just what CSP's theory is, it would be what? If it's 10 billion for that set of neighborhoods, we're talking about 50, 60 billion. That's not going to come from police departments. The real problem I have with defund the police is that it's not big enough. And I think what you have to be able to show is that we don't need to increase people's taxes to have that investment. The money may be in some of the waste and failure to coalesce and target and coordinate cross agencies, very bad in the county. Billions of dollars in the county are wasted that way. So we do need a better delivery of the agency services to cooperate with the smart cars, send out first responders. All of that has to happen, but it requires a reorganization of how portions of the agencies in the city and the county work. Beyond that, the money is in the prison industrial complex, but most importantly in the military industrial complex. One plane, the F-35. My dad was a career Air Force officer and a spy. He knew every branch of the military and every fixed wing aircraft you can know. He said not a single branch of the United States military wants the F-35. Hughes and Boeing Corporation need the F-35. Do you know what the price, the lifetime price of that one plane is? $1 trillion. One plane. That Osprey that got 360 minutes episodes, that's 500 billion, okay, over its lifetime. We don't even need those weapon systems. They're dumb weapon systems for the challenges we face now. So the money has been invested in systems. The defunding of our community has been to shovel public wealth over to those systems and in tax breaks for the top 2 to 0.01%. So the money is there. I guess what Fernando and I are saying is we need a realistic framework. Tell the public what the real price is to actually get these communities to a healthy level. Don't just nickel and dime it and hold a photo op. These are long-term decades-long strategies. And the problem that we really have is that when new chiefs come in and new council people come in and new mayors come in, they think, oh, that was the last mayor's thing. Let me do something that makes me look good. Well, no, you need to take the baton. This is a relay race. The new chief coming in, it's not about you doing a star turn so you get reappointed. It's about carrying out a sustained strategy of safety in the hot zones. Continue CSP. And if you can give the politicians the thumbs up for the new bureau, the CSP bureau, that will encourage support as we build a larger political demand. This is a problem of political will. Both the spiral of despair side is a problem of political will, and changing policing culture and identity and mindset and operations is a problem of political will.
All right, I think we're past our time. So I really want to thank Connie and Fernando and everybody who participated. I think this was a really good presentation and very informative. And I will say this is the first time I had heard that the Bureau was created. So that is a very positive development. Gives some permanency to this. So again, thanks everybody. And if you're in a position to do so, feel free to contribute to Urban Peace Institute. And with that, we'll say goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Fernando. Good to see you.
Hey, good to see you. Thanks for being here.
All right. Bye-bye.